In a quiet little town surrounded by endless fields of golden wheat, there lived a farmer who worked hard every day to take care of his land. His family had been farming this soil for generations, and it was more than just a place to grow crops. It was home. The farmer wasn't rich, but he didn't need much. He had his farm, his memories, and one loyal companion, a scruffy, mixed-breed dog that had become his best friend over the years. The dog wasn't anything special to look at. Patchy, fur, a crooked tail, and ears that never seemed to stand straight. But to the farmer, he was priceless. They'd found each other years ago when the dog was just a scrawny pup wandering the roads alone. Ever since then, they'd been inseparable. Whether it was plowing the fields, fixing fences, or simply sitting on the porch watching the sunset, the dog was always by his side. He named him Rufus because it sounded strong and dependable, just like the bond they shared. One crisp autumn morning, everything changed. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the farmyard, when the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the peaceful silence. The farmer peeked out of his kitchen window and saw 2 police cars parked haphazardly near his barn. There, flashing lights pierced through the calm dawn, an unwelcome sight in such a quiet place. 4 officers stepped out, their faces serious, almost cold. They looked out of place here, where life moved slowly and people minded their own business. The leader of the group approached the house, his boots heavy on the wooden steps leading up to the porch. "Morning," he said gruffly, not bothering to introduce himself properly. "We're looking into reports of stolen equipment being stored on your property. We'll need to search the premises." The farmer blinked, caught off guard. Stolen equipment? On his farm? It made no sense. He hadn't heard any rumors about thefts in the area, let alone anything involving his land. Still, he tried to stay. I don't know what you're talking about," he replied evenly. "You won't find anything here. This is my family's farm. We've been here for decades." But the officers weren't interested in explanations. They brushed past him, ignoring his protests as they headed toward the barn. Rufus, sensing something was wrong, stood protectively beside the farmer. His hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. To Rufus, these strangers were intruders, and he wasn't going to let them wander around unchecked. One of the officers noticed the dog immediately. "Call him off," he barked, pointing at Rufus with obvious discomfort. When the farmer hesitated, trying to reassure both the dog and the nervous officer, things escalated quickly. Without warning, the man pulled out his gun. "I said call him off," he shouted again, louder this time. The farmer froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "He's not dangerous. He's just protecting me," he pleaded. But before he could say another word, a single gunshot rang out, sharp and deafening in the stillness of the morning. Rufus yelped once, a heartbreaking sound that cut through the air, and then collapsed onto the ground. Time seemed to stop. The farmer stared at his beloved dog, unable to believe what had just happened. Rufus lay motionless, his eyes wide with shock and pain. For a moment, all he could hear was the ringing in his ears and the distant chirping of birds, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding below. Then anger surged inside him, hot and overwhelming. How could they do this? Why would anyone shoot an innocent animal without reason? The officers barely reacted. One muttered something about the dog being threat, but none of them looked sorry for what they'd done. Instead, they continued their search, acting as if nothing unusual had occurred. The farmer knelt beside Rufus, tears streaming down his face, feeling utterly powerless. In that moment, he realized how small and insignificant he must seem to them, a simple farmer standing in the way of whatever mission they thought they were on. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. The farmer couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The officers might have come looking for stolen goods, but their actions felt reckless, even cruel. And now, Rufus was gone. The loss hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him hollow and raw. Yet deep down he also sensed that this was only the beginning. Something bigger was happening here, something he couldn't yet understand. For now, though, all he could do was sit with Rufus, stroking his fur one last time as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The once peaceful farm felt heavy with grief and unease, as if the very ground beneath their feet was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. After the gut-wrenching loss of his dog, the farmer sat frozen, his mind racing but his body refusing to move. The officers had already made their way into the barn, their boots stomping loudly on the wooden floor. From where he knelt beside Rufus, the farmer, could hear them rummaging through tools, equipment, and old crates that had been sitting untouched for years. Their voices echoed in the quiet morning air, clipped, authoritative, and dismissive. They were acting like they owned the place, as if they had every right to tear it apart. The farmer clenched his fists, anger bubbling inside him. But there was something else too, a strange uneasiness creeping over him. It wasn't just grief or frustration. It was something deeper, almost primal. The hair on the back of his neck stood up and a chill ran down his spine. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the shadows. But the fields were empty, the horizon stretching endlessly under the pale autumn sun. Still, the feeling lingered, gnawing at him. Inside the barn, things were starting to get weird. At first, it was small stuff, things you might brush off if you weren't paying attention. One officer reached for a wrench hanging on the wall, only for it to clatter to the ground without being touched. Another swore under his breath, insisting he'd heard footsteps above them, even though the loft was clearly empty. A third man laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. Probably just rats, he joked, but his voice cracked halfway through. Then the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a quick dimming and brightening of the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, the pause in the light grew longer, plunging the barn into near darkness before snapping back on. One officer cursed and smacked the side of the light fixture with the palm of his hand. "Must be faulty wiring," he muttered, though no one looked convinced. That's when the radio crackled. At first, it sounded like normal static, the kind you'd expect from any police radio. But then came a voice, faint and distorted, speaking words none of them could make out. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Dispatch?" one of them called into the device, pressing the talk button repeatedly. There was no response. Just more static, louder this time, filling the barn with an eerie white noise that seemed to seep into their bones. "Let's get out of here," one of them said finally, his voice trembling. "This is ridiculous." But when they turned toward the door, it wouldn't open. Two of the men pushed against it together, grunting with effort, but it didn't budge. "What the hell?" one snapped, yanking on the handle so hard it rattled. They tried the windows next, smashing at them with their batons, but the glass refused to break. It was as if some invisible force was holding everything in place, trapping them inside. Panic began to set in. The youngest officer, barely out of training, started pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. "This isn't happening. This can't be real." His hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, only to find there was no signal. The others weren't faring much better. Even the leader of the group, who had seemed so confident earlier, looked rattled. And then they saw it. The far end of the barn, near the stack of hay bales, a shadow moved. It wasn't the kind of shadow cast by sunlight or lamplight. It was darker, denser, almost alive. It shifted slowly at first, taking the vague shape of a person, before dissolving into nothingness. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the officers broke the silence. "Did you see that? Tell me you saw that." No one answered. Instead, they stared at the spot where the shadow had been, their faces pale. Whatever skepticism they'd clung to earlier was gone now, replaced by raw fear. The barn, once familiar and ordinary, suddenly felt alien, like it belonged to another world entirely. Outside, the farmer noticed none of this. He was still sitting with Rufus, lost in his own thoughts, when he heard muffled shouting coming from inside the barn. At first, he assumed it was just the officers arguing among themselves. But then the noises grew louder. Angry voices, frantic footsteps, the sound of something heavy hitting the wall. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stood up, brushing dirt off his jeans. Walking closer to the barn, he hesitated. Part of Him wanted to leave those men to whatever trouble they'd brought upon themselves. After all, they'd shown no mercy to Rufus. But another part of him couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. Not just because of what had happened to his dog, but because of the way the air around the farm seemed charged, electric, like the calm before a storm. As he approached the barn door, he heard a loud crash from inside, followed by a sharp cry of pain. Without thinking, he called out, "Hey, you guys okay in there?" His voice echoed eerily in the stillness, but there was no reply. Only silence. And yet somehow the silence felt heavier than the chaos that had come before. Standing there, the farmer realized he had a choice to make. He could walk away, let karma take its course, and hope those officers got what they deserved. Or he could step in, try to help, and risk putting himself in harm's way. Either way, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening inside that barn, it wasn't natural. And whether it was coincidence or something more, it had started the moment Rufus died. For a brief second, he wondered if the land itself was fighting back, if the soil his family had worked for generations had absorbed the injustice done that day and awakened something ancient, something protective. It was a crazy thought, but after everything he'd seen, it didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. Taking a deep breath, the farmer grabbed a crowbar from the shed and headed back to the barn. Whatever was going on in there, he needed answers. And maybe, just maybe, he owed it to Rufus to find out. The farmer stood outside the barn, gripping the crowbar tightly in his hand. His heart was pounding and his mind raced with questions. What was happening inside? Was it really possible that something supernatural was at play? Or was it just fear and panic making the officers imagine things? He didn't have answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore what was going on. The land, the barn, even the air around him felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. It was as if the farm itself had come, alive, reacting to the injustice of Rufus's death. Taking a deep breath, he called out again, louder this time. "Hey, open the door. Let me help." His voice echoed into the barn, but there was no response. Instead, he heard more muffled shouts and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Whatever was happening in there, it wasn't good. He tried the barn door again, pushing against it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he stepped back and examined it closely. There was no lock, no bolt holding it shut. It was just stuck, as if some unseen force was keeping it closed. The farmer shook his head, trying to push away the strange thoughts creeping into his mind. This wasn't the time to dwell on superstitions or old stories. He needed to focus on getting those men out. Grabbing the crowbar, he wedged it between the door and the frame and pulled with everything he had. The wood groaned under the pressure, and finally, with a loud crack, the door gave way. It swung open just enough for him to slip inside. As he stepped into the barn, the first thing he noticed was how cold it was. The temperature inside was drastically lower than outside, sending a shiver down his spine. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint smell of earth and damp hay filled his nostrils. Inside, the scene was chaos. Tools were scattered everywhere, crates overturned, and the officers looked like they'd been through a war. One of them was clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. Another was leaning against the wall, pale and trembling, while two others argued loudly, their voices rising in panic. None of them seemed to notice the farmer standing there at first. When they finally did, their expressions ranged from relief to outright fear. "What took you so long?" one of them snapped, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "We've been trapped in here." "Trapped?" the farmer replied, raising an eyebrow. "You came onto my property, killed my dog, and now you're blaming me for this mess?" His words hung in the air, sharp and accusing. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the injured officer groaned, breaking the tension. Blood dripped onto the floor, dark and sticky, and the farmer realized he couldn't hold on to his anger. Not right now, anyway. These men might deserve whatever trouble they were in, but leaving them to bleed out wasn't the answer. Let's "Get you patched up," he said gruffly, nodding toward the wounded man. "Then we'll figure out what's going on." Reluctantly, the officers followed him outside. The sunlight felt warm and comforting after the eerie chill of the barn. The farmer led them to the porch where he kept a basic first aid kit. As he cleaned and bandaged the injured officer's wound, the others sat silently, their earlier bravado completely gone. They glanced nervously at the barn, as if expecting something, or someone, to come bursting out at any moment. Once the immediate crisis was handled, the farmer turned to them. "What exactly were you looking for in there?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "Because I can tell you right now there's nothing stolen on this property. My family has worked this land for generations. We don't deal in shady business." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the leader spoke up, his voice quieter than before. "We got a tip-off," he admitted. "Someone said they saw stolen equipment being brought here late at night. We didn't mean for things to go this far, but once we started searching, things got weird." "Weird doesn't begin to cover it," muttered another officer, rubbing his temples. "That place is cursed or something." The word cursed sent a jolt through the farmer. He'd grown up hearing stories about the land, whispers passed down from his grandparents about a curse tied to the property. Back then, he'd dismissed them as old tales meant to scare kids. But now, faced with what had happened to Rufus and the bizarre events in the barn, he wasn't so sure anymore. Determined to find answers, the farmer decided to dig deeper. After sending the officers off with strict instructions to leave his property immediately, he headed to the attic. It was a dusty, forgotten space filled with boxes of old papers, photographs, and journals left behind by his ancestors. He hadn't touched most of these items in years, but now he sifted through them carefully, searching for anything that might shed light on the strange occurrences. It didn't take long to find something interesting. Buried beneath stacks of yellowed documents was an old journal belonging to his grandfather. Flipping through its pages, the farmer discovered entries detailing a bitter feud between his grandfather and a local lawman decades ago. According to the journal, the lawman, a corrupt sheriff, had used the farm as a front for smuggling operations, hiding stolen goods beneath the soil. When the farmer's grandfather uncovered the truth, he destroyed the evidence and kicked the sheriff off the land. Furious, the sheriff vowed revenge, claiming he'd placed a curse on the property. Anyone who dared trespass with ill intentions, he swore, would face dire consequences. Reading these words, the farmer felt a mix of guilt and awe. Could the curse be real? Had the land somehow protected itself, and him, by turning against the officers? It was a wild idea, but given everything that had happened, it didn't seem impossible. The farm had always felt special to him, like it had a life of its own. Maybe it did. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, the farmer sat quietly on the porch, the journal resting in his lap. He thought about Rufus, about the officers, and about the strange, otherworldly events that had unfolded. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear. The land had spoken, and it demanded respect. And maybe, just maybe, justice had found a way to prevail, even if it came from beyond the grave. The farmer sat on the porch long after the officers had left, staring out at the fields bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The journal lay open on his lap, its pages whispering secrets from another time. He couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself had risen up, not just to protect him, but to deliver a kind of justice he'd never imagined possible. It wasn't revenge, exactly. It felt deeper than that. Like the farm had been waiting, biding its time until someone crossed a line it wouldn't tolerate. But as much as he tried to piece things together, questions lingered. Was this really the work of some ancient curse? Or was it something else, entirely? Something rooted in grief and loss that his mind was struggling to process? Rufus's death still weighed heavily on him, a wound too fresh to heal. And yet, there was a strange comfort in thinking that maybe, just maybe, his loyal companion hadn't died for nothing. If the events in the barn were any indication, Rufus's life and death had sparked something powerful. Inside the house, the farmer's thoughts drifted back to the officers. They'd looked so different when they stumbled out of the barn. Broken, humbled, almost unrecognizable from the brash figures who'd arrived earlier that morning. One of them, the one with the injured arm, had muttered an apology before climbing into their car. "We didn't mean for this to happen," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. But the farmer hadn't responded. What could he say? An apology wouldn't bring Rufus back. Words felt hollow now, meaningless compared to the weight of what had transpired. Still, watching them drive away, he couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. Those men weren't monsters. They were human beings, flawed and frightened, caught in a situation far beyond their control. Maybe they'd learned something today, even if it came at a cost. Maybe they'd carry the memory of this day with them forever, a reminder of the consequences of their actions. As night fell, the farmer decided to check on the barn one last time. He wasn't sure why. He told himself it was just to make sure everything was secure. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about the barn called to him, pulling him back like a magnet. Grabbing a flashlight, he walked across the yard, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every sound around you. When he reached the barn, he hesitated before stepping inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Tools hung neatly on the walls, hay bales were stacked in their usual corner, and the floor was clean except for a few scuff marks where the officers had struggled earlier. But then, as he moved deeper into the space, he noticed something odd. On the dirt floor near the center of the barn, there was a faint outline, a shape etched into the ground as though someone had traced it with a stick. The farmer knelt down for a closer look, running his fingers over the lines. They formed a rough circle, jagged and uneven, but unmistakably deliberate. Inside the circle were symbols he didn't recognize, scratched into the earth with precision that didn't match the chaos of the day. It was as if someone, or something, had taken great care to leave this mark behind. A chill ran down his spine. He stood up quickly, shining the flashlight around the barn again. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting eerily in the dim light. For a moment, he thought he heard a faint whisper, like voices carried on the wind. But when he turned toward the sound, there was nothing there, just empty space and the lingering scent of damp hay. "Enough of this," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "You're letting your imagination get the best of you." But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, the feeling persisted. The barn wasn't just a building anymore, it was alive, breathing, watching. Every creak of the wooden beams, every rustle of straw seemed to echo louder than before. He didn't stay long after that. Locking the door behind him, he hurried back to the house, glancing over his shoulder more times than he cared to admit. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. Rufus's death, the officer's panic, the strange markings in the barn. Each moment felt like a piece of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Finally, unable to bear the restlessness any longer, he got up and went to the kitchen. Pouring himself a cup of coffee, he sat at the table and opened the journal again. Flipping through the pages, he found more details about the feud between his grandfather and the corrupt sheriff. Apparently, the sheriff hadn't acted alone. He'd been part of a larger network of criminals using the area as a hub for illegal activities. When the farmer's grandfather exposed the operation, he became a target. Threats were made, property was vandalized, and tensions ran high for months. Eventually, the sheriff was forced to leave town, but not before making his ominous vow. Anyone who trespassed on the land with ill intentions would suffer the same fate he did. The farmer closed the journal, leaning back in his chair. It all sounded so dramatic, like something out of an old movie. Yet here he was, living proof that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Whatever force had protected the farm all those years ago, it was still active, and it had chosen today to remind everyone, including him, of its power. By morning, the world outside felt calmer, brighter. The sun rose steadily over the horizon, painting the fields gold. Birds chirped cheerfully, and the breeze carried the sweet smell of freshly turned soil. The farmer stepped outside, taking a deep breath. Despite everything, life went on. The hay farm was safe, for now. He walked to the spot where Rufus had fallen, kneeling beside the patch of earth that had absorbed so much pain. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small handful of seeds. They were wildflower seeds, ones Rufus used to love sniffing whenever they worked in the garden together. Pressing them gently into the soil, he whispered, "You were always my best friend, boy. I'll never forget you." As he stood up, he noticed something new growing nearby, a tiny sprout pushing its way through the dirt. It hadn't been there yesterday. Smiling faintly, he realized it might be corn or wheat, crops planted by his ancestors decades ago. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a gift from the land, a sign that life always finds a way to renew itself. For the first time since Rufus's death, the farmer felt a flicker of hope. Justice had been served in its own mysterious way, and while the scars would take time to heal, he knew one thing for certain: the farm would endure. It always had, and it always would. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for the farmer. Grief, anger, confusion, they all swirled together like storm clouds refusing to break. But as the shock of what had happened began to fade, the reality of the situation settled. And Rufus was gone, and nothing could change that. The officers who had caused so much pain were now back in their own lives, dealing with whatever fallout awaited them. And the farm, the land that had stood witness to it all, was quiet again, almost too quiet. Word about the incident spread quickly through the small town. People talked in hushed tones at the grocery store, over coffee at the diner, and during Sunday sermons at church. Videos of Rufus's death surfaced online, captured by someone who had been driving past the farm that morning. The footage wasn't clear. It showed only flashes of movement and the sound of the gunshot, but it was enough to ignite outrage. Within hours, social media exploded with posts calling for justice. Hashtags like "Justice for Rufus" and "Protect Our Farmers" trended locally, drawing attention not just to the tragedy but to broader issues of police misconduct and systemic inequality. The farmer didn't ask for any of this. He'd never sought the spotlight, preferring to live quietly and focus on his work. But as reporters started showing up at his doorstep, microphones in hand and cameras rolling, he realized he couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about him or Rufus anymore. It was bigger than that. If sharing his story could help prevent something like this from happening to someone else, then he owed it to Rufus and to himself to speak up. At first, talking about what had happened felt unbearable. Every word reopened wounds that hadn't yet begun to heal. But as he recounted the events to journalists, community leaders, and even strangers who reached out to offer support, he found strength he didn't know he had. People listened, not just because they were curious, but because they cared. They saw themselves in his story, whether they lived on farms or in cities, whether they owned pets or simply believed in fairness. Rufus became more than just a dog. He became a symbol of innocence lost and justice denied. In the weeks that followed, protests erupted across the region. Hundreds of people gathered in town squares holding signs with messages like "No more violence" and "Respect our communities." Some brought their own dogs, standing shoulder to shoulder with the farmer when he joined them. Others shared stories of similar encounters with law enforcement, revealing patterns of abuse and neglect that had long gone unaddressed. For many, Rufus's death was the final straw, the moment they decided they couldn't stay silent anymore. The officers involved in the raid faced mounting pressure from both the public and their superiors. An internal investigation was launched, though progress was slow and details scarce. One officer was suspended without pay, while another retired abruptly, citing stress and personal reasons. None of them issued a formal apology beyond vague statements expressing regret for the unfortunate outcome. To the farmer, these words felt empty, like Band-Aids slapped over a gaping wound. Justice, he knew, would take time, and it might never fully arrive. Despite the lack of closure, the farmer tried to focus on rebuilding his life. He spent long hours tending to the fields, letting the rhythm of the work soothe his restless mind. Each row of crops planted, each fence repaired, felt like a step forward, a way of reclaiming control after days of chaos. Yet no matter how hard he worked, there were moments when grief hit him like a tidal wave. Simple things triggered memories: the sound of a car engine pulling into the driveway, the sight of an empty food bowl on the porch, the way the wind rustled through the grass where Rufus used to run. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the farmer sat on the porch with a cup of tea. A neighbor had dropped off a basket of fresh baked bread earlier that day, along with a note saying, "Thinking of you." It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. In times like these, kindness mattered more than anything. As he sipped his tea, he noticed a group of kids playing in the field nearby. They were laughing, chasing each other around, completely carefree. Watching them reminded him of Rufus, the joy he'd brought to every corner of the farm, the unconditional love that had made even the hardest days bearable. Tears welled up in his eyes, but this time they weren't just tears of sadness. There was gratitude in them too, for the years he'd shared with Rufus, for the lessons he'd learned, for the resilience he'd discovered within himself. Later that night, unable to sleep, the farmer wandered outside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the fields. He walked to the barn, its shadow stretching long across the yard. Pushing open the door, he stepped inside, shining his flashlight around the space. The strange markings on the floor were still there, faint but unmistakable. He ran his fingers over them again, feeling the grooves etched into the dirt. Whatever force had acted that day, it had left its mark, not just on the barn, but on him. Standing there in the quiet darkness, the farmer made a promise to himself. He wouldn't let Rufus's death be in vain. He would honor his memory by continuing to fight for what was right, not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved better. Whether it was speaking out against injustice, supporting others facing similar struggles, or simply living with integrity and compassion, he vowed to keep moving forward. By the time he returned to the house, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. The fields sparkled with dew and birds chirped cheerfully, welcoming the new day. Life, he realized, was full of cycles: birth, death, renewal. The farm had taught him that lesson time and time again, and now, standing on the cusp of a new chapter, he understood it in a way he never had before. Rufus might be gone, but his spirit lived on, in the wildflowers sprouting near the porch, in the growing movement for justice, in the farmer's heart. And as long as the farmer kept planting seeds, literal or metaphorical, Rufus's legacy would continue to grow, spreading roots deeper than anyone could imagine. Months passed, and life on the farm slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The fields were thriving again, their golden crops swaying gently in the breeze as if nothing had ever disturbed them. Chickens clucked happily in their coop, and the old tractor hummed steadily as it trudged through the rows of corn. But for the farmer, things would never be quite the same. Rufus's absence was still felt in every corner of the property: a patch of sunlight that should have been his favorite spot, an empty bowl by the door, the silence where there used to be playful barks. Yet amidst the grief, something else had taken root: purpose. The movement sparked by Rufus's story continued to grow, spreading far beyond the small town. People from all over reached out, some sharing their own experiences with loss or injustice, others offering words of encouragement or asking how they could help. The farmer became an unlikely figurehead for change, speaking at community meetings, writing letters to local officials, and even appearing on television to talk about accountability and reform. It wasn't easy stepping into this role. He often felt out of place under the spotlight, unsure of what to say or how to act. But each time he hesitated, he reminded himself of why he was doing it: for Rufus, for fairness, for everyone who deserved better. One day, while walking near the edge of the property, The farmer noticed something unexpected. A sapling had sprouted, in the exact spot where Rufus had fallen. Its tiny green leaves reached toward the sky, fragile yet determined. He knelt beside it, brushing away bits of dirt to reveal its delicate roots. It was a young oak tree, one he hadn't planted himself. Where had it come from? Seeds didn't just appear out of nowhere, especially not oaks. Maybe it had been carried by the wind or dropped by a bird, or maybe, just maybe, it was a gift from the land itself, a living tribute to Rufus. Touched by the sight, the farmer decided to nurture the little tree. He watered it daily, protected it from harsh winds, and made sure no animals nibbled at its tender shoots. Over time, it began to grow stronger, its trunk thickening and its branches stretching wider. The farmer started calling it Rufus's tree. Visitors to the farm noticed it too, leaving small tokens of remembrance at its base. A collar tag, a handwritten note, a faded dog toy. Slowly but surely, the tree became a gathering point, a symbol of hope and resilience for anyone who needed. And as the seasons changed, so did the lives of those connected to the incident. Some of the officers involved tried to move on, though none escaped unscathed. One man left law enforcement altogether, haunted by guilt and nightmares of shadowy figures chasing him through endless barns. Another doubled down on his beliefs, blaming everything on bad luck rather than taking responsibility. Still, others sought redemption in quieter ways, volunteering at animal shelters or mentoring young recruits about the importance of compassion and restraint. Their paths diverged, but the memory of that fateful day lingered for all of them, shaping their choices in ways they couldn't ignore. For the farmer, healing came in fits and starts. There were mornings when the weight of everything felt unbearable, when the thought of facing another sunrise without Rufus brought tears to his eyes. But there were also moments of peace, sitting beneath Rufus's tree, watching the sun dip below the horizon, listening to the crickets sing their nightly song. Those moments reminded him that life, like the farm itself, was resilient. It adapted, it grew, it found a way to keep going. One evening, as autumn painted the landscape in shades of amber and crimson, the farmer hosted a small gathering at the farm. Friends, neighbors, and strangers who had followed his journey came together to celebrate progress and honor Rufus's memory. Someone brought a guitar and played soft melodies while others shared stories around a crackling bonfire. Children ran through the fields, laughing freely, their joy infectious. Even the air seemed lighter, filled with warmth and gratitude. Standing beside Rufus's tree, the farmer looked out at the crowd and felt a swell of emotion. These people weren't just here because of him. They were here because of Rufus. Because of the bond they'd shared, because of the love and loyalty Rufus had embodied, because of the ripple effect his death had created. In losing his best friend, the farmer had gained something profound, a deeper understanding of connection, of community, of the power of standing up for what's right. When the night grew cooler and the fire burned low, the farmer stepped forward to speak. His voice was steady, though tinged with emotion. "I never wanted any of this," he began, gesturing to the crowd. "All I wanted was to live my life, take care of my farm, and spend my days with Rufus. But sometimes life gives us more than we ask for. Sometimes it challenges us to rise above our pain and do something meaningful." He paused, glancing at the tree behind him before continuing. "Rufus taught me what it means to love unconditionally, to protect fiercely, and to find joy in the simplest things. And now his spirit lives on, not just in this tree but in all of you, in your kindness, your courage, your determination to make the world a better place. That's his legacy, and it's one I'll carry with me for the rest of my days." The crowd erupted into applause, some wiping away tears, others nodding in agreement. As the night drew to a close and guests began heading home, the farmer stayed behind, lingering near Rufus's tree. He placed a hand on its sturdy trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath his fingers. "Thank you, boy," he whispered softly, knowing deep down that Rufus could hear him somehow. "You gave me strength when I needed it most. I won't let you down." Under the starlit sky, the farm stood silent once more, its soil rich with history and promise. The land had spoken, delivering justice in its own mysterious way. And though the scars of the past remained, they were softened by the knowledge that growth was possible, even after the hardest winters. For the farmer, Rufus's tree was proof of that. It was a reminder that no matter how dark things might seem, light always finds a way to break through.